Hello, I'm Dr. Steve Hassan, and I'm delighted to have Frederick Clarkson, Senior Analyst at Political Research Associates, someone I've known for decades, a colleague and friend who is an expert on, in my mind, and in many people's minds, on religious freedom, issues of politics in the United States, and with what's happening in America. I said, Fred, please come back on and tell us what the heck's happening and what we should do. So, Fred, take it away, please.
It seems like it's a dark time, in the country and in the world, and so it could seem like, well, there's nothing to be done. You know, things are spinning out of control, but I think that there are, and I think that the good news is, despite the attack on the Capitol and despite all the issues around the elections, and so many scandals, our democratic institutions are actually pretty resilient. Nothing has collapsed. The government still works. And there's always been issues, throughout American history and the history of any society. We even had a civil war. The 30s were not pretty, and during the Depression, and goons would be out beating union organizers with baseball bats and that kind of stuff. So, arguably, we're in a relatively peaceful time compared to many times in our history, and I think it's important that we really remember that.
Thank you for that, because I think people need a bigger perspective and some hope, honestly.
Well, I think so. I mean, you and I are both old enough to remember the civil rights era and the Vietnam War era. And I'm sorry, those were much more difficult times than what we are right now. The issues are in some ways the same and in some ways very different. But I think we need to have confidence that the institutions and the kind of culture that we built over the centuries, or arguably over the millennia, still works, and it could work better, to be sure. But that's the first thing people need to have in mind. Our problems, as difficult as they may be, have solutions.
Great. That's what I'm all about in my as a therapist. I'm looking for, if you got what you needed, what would need to happen, in the person's development and growth. And I really, there's so much disinformation and confusion and fear mongering. So please continue.
Well, yeah, and I think that the first step is to recognize what you just said, that there is fear mongering and disinformation out there. And it's important that things be done about that, but there are things that we ourselves can do about it, and that is to be aware that it exists in the first place,
Right.
and to be better consumers, of information, and know who our friends are, who you can kind of trust to have good judgment and to carry things forward with. Those are the things that matter, and it's not just family. If
Right.
democracy means a commitment to a process in a larger culture. Government isn't something that's other than us. It is us. It's what we've all agreed to do together to accomplish our aims as society. And if we feel our governmental institutions have gone a little bit astray, well, we have a correction for that. It's called elections.
Yes.
And so the first big piece of what the answers are, and there are others, and that is that I think we've taken a lot of these things for granted. And some of these things really are at risk. And we don't have to go over what all those risks are to know that everybody experiences that. So what then to do? Well, first thing to do to salvage democracy in our institutions is to actually do some democracy. And by that, I mean, it doesn't mean just registering to vote, wait for somebody to tell you who to vote for. It means actually being engaged in the political process itself. Political parties are important, but beyond political parties, you need to know what are the mechanics of electoral democracy itself. I remember being involved in an electoral campaign some years ago, first big one I'd ever been involved with. And I remember standing holding signs at an intersection, for the candidate. And just in talking to people, they're all very educated people, many with PhDs, and just in talking to people, they knew more about what was happening in Baghdad than they did about what are the rules on signs? How big can they be? How far do you have to stand from the road? They hadn't really done democracy. As educated as they were ignorant about the basic institutions of our society, because that's where the rubber meets the road. How do you do it? How do you get an absentee ballot? When do you need to get an absentee ballot? What are the rules around that? This ought to be more common knowledge than it is.
Yeah.
So you may know the starting lineup, of your favorite sports team, and maybe you know who your member of Congress is, but do you know who's on the school board? Do you know who's coming up to be a potential school board member or a city councilor or a state legislator? We need to know at least as much about stuff like that as we do about our sports and college sports teams.
That's so important that you said that, and I couldn't help but remember the meme. Think globally, act locally, yeah. And that's what I'm hearing you say is know the mechanics of how democracy works, what civics is, yeah. But also get to know your community. And I think when you were saying a lot of intellectuals know more about what's happening elsewhere in the world, it's because they're part of the corporate media structure, not necessarily reading their local newspapers or like engaging with their neighbors, right?
Well, yeah, and it's not just a corporate media issue. These are people who might have been critics of the corporate media as a general rule, I think.
I see.
It's just that their interests and their orientation, their deep, well-justified concerns are somewhere elsewhere about, say, human rights in some other part of the world, or a war, or very interesting things. I care about those things too. But again, if you don't know what's going on in the politics of your own town, how many people are registered to vote? Who on your side, who do you think you can get to register to vote and to participate? I mean, this is what's important, and if you don't understand that, you're going to be losing elections and you're going to wonder what in the world happened. My town's not like that.
Yeah, and if I may, Fred, just, we live in Massachusetts, so we have a Republican governor, but it's pretty, Democratic oriented blue state. I also want you to talk about what we can do with other states that are perhaps not, that we're not living in locally, but what we can do to help later in the conversation too.
Sure. So let's flip over to one other thing that sort of involves electoral life and democratic life, but it also involves how we think about these things and how we can what is a democratic culture in the first place, and how do you know? Right. And the first thing, and one of the first things that the framers of the Constitution tried to figure out was this whole business about religious freedom, mm-hmm. which for most of us, most of the time these days, religious freedom is something that the bad guys are doing to justify the bad things that they do. And so, well, you could say religious freedom is not those things. I don't believe you should discriminate against LGBTQ people. I don't believe that hospitals should be able to refuse people who are trans, and who have mental health issues. All those kinds of things where, well, my religion tells me that I don't have to do these things. And there's a political movement to allow these sorts of things to happen. But that's not what most of us were raised to understand what religious freedom is. And it's certainly not what the framers of the Constitution were thinking about. And you strip away all the big noise about the Constitution and the laws and all that. I mean, what in the world are Madison and Jefferson and those people talking about? Well, the first thing they understood is religious freedom is not really about religion. Now, that's a very hard thing for people to get their mind around. It took me a long time, I'll tell you, but it's not. But it was just the way that people thought about those things at the time, And but what Madison and Jefferson were really talking about, they're synonyms for religious freedom. One was, you'll like this, Steve, freedom of the mind. Mm-hmm. Freedom of the mind. And the other synonym that they used was the right of individual conscience. Mm. So if that's what they're getting at, it's like, well, yeah, that has everything and nothing to do with religion. Religion at the time was part of the system of government. You had the Anglican Church propping up the British empires, control of the colonies, and they had a lot of political control, and boy, did they exercise it against potential competing systems. One of the formative experiences of the young James Madison was watching Baptist preachers preaching the gospel as they understood it, being beaten and jailed. And for him, that got him thinking about what in the world is religious freedom? What does it mean to have those things? And so they wanted to make it possible for individuals to believe as they will or not, and change their mind in whatever way they wanted to, whenever they wanted to, without the undue influence of powerful religious and governmental institutions, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that was a big idea in those days. Something we kind of take for granted, but in fact, the people who were those kinds of powerful institutions at the time, or who wanted to be, their descendants are still with us, and they've never given up that fight. They don't believe in religious freedom as we might understand it. They don't believe in democracy as we might understand it. And so they do everything they can to undermine the right of individual freedom for you and me in order to prop up the institutions and the systems of belief that they support. And so once we get our minds around that, it's like, well, religious freedom doesn't belong to powerful churches or politicians in government. It belongs to us. And that there are people who want to undermine and seize our individual beliefs and our conscious ideas in order to be able to steer us towards whatever they want us to do and to believe and to think. And so it's important on the one hand to be defensive. It's like learning how to drive. The first thing you do is you're taught about defensive driving. It doesn't matter what you do. It matters what the other guy coming at you might be doing. And that's a matter of just common sense, in society, no matter what it is. But we forget that it has to do with our precious sacred right to religious freedom too, because there are people who want to take it away from you.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank you because it was you who said to me many decades ago now, Steve, when the Moonies lied to you to recruit them in, they were infringing on your religious freedom as a Jew because you didn't know what you were getting involved with, and you were spot on.
And they wanted to make sure that you didn't know what you were getting involved with, and used all sorts of manipulations and tricks and lies in order to gull you out and for you to completely transfer your loyalty to a different religious system.
Right. And in my work, my doctoral dissertation, one of the critical points in forensics is informed consent. Did the person who is being influenced understand who you are, what you believe, and what's going to happen to you if you follow what they're directing you to do? And I had no clue. I was overtly lied to, and vital information was kept from me, and it was a violation of my freedom, for sure.
Well, absolutely. And as you know, and I learned from you, it's once again, the issue of cults and mind control and those kinds of issues are also not limited to matters of religion.
Right.
And it's really a system of techniques, and methods that are used to try to steal your beliefs and get you into theirs. And it can be, psychology groups, it can be business groups, it can be political groups, it can be a lot of things I probably even thought of. But as we know, a lot of the defense, right, around cult issues, people say, "Oh, well, you're a bigot if you think that a group is a cult." It's like, well, maybe you are, but also maybe you're not. And they're actually legitimate issues of concern that are ignored by the people who think that new religions are somehow exempt from the law, basic ethics, and common human decency that apply to all the rest of us.
Right, exactly. And right now, as we're speaking, R. Kelly is on trial for trafficking and RICO, but that's a cult of personality. It's not even a religious cult or a political cult, but he entranced and enslaved, apparently, a lot of people to do his bidding.
It happens a lot, and it happens in a lot of different settings, as we know. And as a society, as a democratic society, we have not organized ourselves well enough to contend with those things. It's not just a matter of law enforcement, it's a matter of our entire culture and understanding these things happen. And people, no matter how smart they are, no matter how educated they are, no matter how stable they are in their lives, are potentially victimized in this way. And it's sure, there are people who may be more vulnerable than others, but the fact is we're all human and we're all vulnerable.
Amen. I couldn't resist. Sorry.
Quite all right. Quite all right. We have religious freedom here.
Yep, exactly. And freedom to believe and freedom not to believe. Freedom to change your mind. Freedom to ask pointed questions to the leader or the doctrine or the policies of whatever institution we're affiliated with.
Well, that's right. And so that's why in my broader work, I become very concerned when whole political and religious movements are reframing the idea of religious freedom to justify whatever it is that they want to do. And so, the Christian right, the conservative Christian political movement that's developed over a number of decades, they were concerned about certain issues, and we knew what they were. But within the past decade, and particularly in recent years, that entire agenda, whether it's abortion, or it's traditional marriage, right, whether it's matters of homosexuality and equality, all of those things have been reframed in terms of their religious freedom, not only to not have to accept those things,
or to discriminate would be the word I would use. Again,
well, sure, but again, just because I believe something doesn't mean that I'm exempt from the generally applicable laws of the United States, right?
Right.
And this is the thing. So what do you do about that? What do you do in the face of that? Many laws and Supreme Court decisions have been changed to adapt to that point of view. Well, it's the same situation as any point in history. We're in the same situation that Madison and Jefferson found themselves in, different time, different circumstances, but we first have to agree on what religious freedom is to ourselves. Because if we can't argue what religious freedom is, we're not going to get anywhere by complaining about what it isn't.
I completely agree. And you've alluded to dominionism and Christian nationalism. Could you just take a minute to define that? Because I know as a Moonie, I was taught democracy was satanic. We need to create a theocracy to rule the world for God. And anyone who didn't believe what we believed would be converted or they should die.
Well, yeah, there are theocratic elements within conservative Christianity who believe something pretty close to that, and they're growing in political power. One of the seminal theologians of this thing is a guy named R.J. Rushdoony, an American who one of the most influential people in conservative Protestantism over time, and developed a justification for Christian right politics as we understand it. Well, he described democracy as a heresy. And he sees democratic institutions, at least insofar as they allow for things like religious pluralism, meaning everybody has a right to religious freedom and equality under the law. Institutions that support that idea are barriers to the kind of Christian theocracy that he and his followers and their political friends, wish to create. So if you talk to a conservative Christian politics these days, I'm not about theocracy. That's just nonsense, and perhaps they're not. But the implications of their ideas take you there, because there are lots of groups who believe that only Christians of the right sort should be holding public office.
Yep.
And they haven't gone so far as to say that, Christians who don't believe as I do shouldn't, be in public office. But sometimes they actually kind of do.
Yep.
And so never mind the atheists and the Jews and the Hindus and the Buddhists and everybody else who should and do arguably enjoy equal standing under the law, in our democracy, they really see everybody else as second-class citizens. And if they aren't now, they really ought to be. So you see an erosion of democratic norms and an erosion of the idea of equality in favor of a kind of religious supremacism and governmental institutions and politics that go with it.
Yeah, and if I'm accurate, I would say that the old model was keeping women as subservient to men. basically, that they were seeing women as needing to follow the headship of in the family of a man.
Well, sure, and that's certainly not unique to Christian religions by any stretch.
Right.
And but that's been a matter of social change, over a long period of time, and particularly in recent decades. And some people obviously don't like that. They don't like the changes that have come about, and they're still fighting that rearguard action.
Yeah.
And that's why in the Southern Baptist Convention, where Southern Baptists, used to have women preachers. Now they don't, right?
Yeah.
You're not allowed in the pulpit, right? And women are supposed to be submissive to the headship of men in the family. And it's not unique. I don't mean to pick on the Southern Baptists, because it happens throughout evangelical Christianity. And that is that there's a certain hierarchy, and it's a male hierarchy. God the Father, Jesus the Son, the pastor, and the father is head of the family, and that's the structure of the cosmos as people understand it. And you mess with that, you're messing with God.
Yeah, and the ultra-Orthodox Jews leave Jesus out, but it's very male-centric and, patriarchal and and homophobic if you are a strict fundamentalist interpreter.
Well, that's right. So that's why these ideas of equality of other religions, right, and equality for women, equality for LGBTQ people is a threat to the belief systems of these folks. Now, I would argue that they have a right to believe as they will.
Mm-hmm.
It might be unpopular. How can you say that, Fred? Well, it's because they do. If you do, they do too, right? And part of the trick is, in a democratic society, well, what then do we do with, such radically different opinions, living in the same community in the same country and trying to figure out how to live together? And there's one lesson that I learned from one of the theocrats. He's a writer named Gary North, and he's one of the strategic thinkers. And he said a really, really smart thing, and he calls it the dilemma of democratic pluralism. And basically the idea there is that if you believe in democratic pluralism, as people like you and I do, we have to accept, as a matter of philosophy, people who are, we have to accept people and their ideas who are opposed to those things and seeking to end it. Now, that's true. And so most of us then are always living in the dilemma, and it's not comfortable. It's like, how can, I don't want to be the one that's intolerant, and yet those people are being intolerant. How do I navigate that? And here's, as difficult as that is for all of us, the other side knows that we have that dilemma, and they're very good at exploiting it. It's like, you liberals, you're not, you're the ones who are really intolerant. Look at what you say about us. Look at what you do. You don't respect our beliefs as Christians. You are the ones who are the bigots. And most of us don't have good answers to that.
Yeah, I would argue that that's a general strategy of deflect and project onto the other that which you're doing. That's not necessarily kosher. And, my whole approach with people involved with authoritarian groups is to respectfully dialogue, ask questions, and do things to promote a switching of perspective. And mm-hmm. whatever facts, prevail, if in other words, if it stands up to scrutiny, mm-hmm. then you consider changing your mind. But it's not me persuading people you need to think like me. It's really asking questions, empowering them to think.
Right. And so in a lot of ways, it's, to say, I believe in democracy, you have to act like you believe in democracy, and you have to live the values, right? And that's challenging, particularly in light of the dilemma, right?
Right.
And so knowing that the dilemma exists, and knowing that there are people who will use the deflect and project, method, many of them, as you could probably speak to better than I, don't even necessarily know that that's what they're doing, and how dishonest and corrupt it really is. However, there are cynical leaders who know perfectly well what they're doing. And we have to be on the alert for that too. We there one of the things that was said, and I think it was by some people who were opposed to cults, and that is, it's one thing to be a liberal, but you don't want to be so liberal that your brains fall out. And it's like, democracy is hard. It requires learning enough on an ongoing basis, not only to just be a person who supports and values democracy, but understands that there's always going to be threats to it. And the threats change over time. But again, I mean, there were people who argued in the state legislatures, against the ratification of the Constitution. They didn't like the Constitution when it was written, and their descendants don't like it now.
Yeah, and there are some people who want states to be independent and not to have a federal government at all. Texas, I think, wants to secede, or at least there are individuals in Texas that don't want to be part of the United States anymore.
Well, that's right. Texas has had secessionist movements for a while, but we also have more governmental leaders, who in Texas, but also elsewhere, who are taking that view. One former member of Congress, a man named Alan West, who was the recent past chairman of the Republican Party in Texas, is challenging the incumbent Republican governor, and he has supported the idea of secession. So it's very important that people understand that these ideas are current in high levels of American public life.
Great. So please talk about Project Blitz, Project Blitz Watch, and anything else that you think that people need to know. But you choose what order you want to share.
Well, sure. Let's talk a little bit about Project Blitz, because it involves all of these things. And as you would expect, so Project Blitz is a secretive state legislative campaign of the Christian right. And it was started by this organization called the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, which was an offshoot of what the Congressional Prayer Caucus, which is exactly what it sounds like. People getting together to pray and to have fellowship in that way in congressional offices. And so a member of Congress who started, this guy Randy Forbes, a committed conservative Christian political activist, thought it'd be a good idea to collect all the collective wisdom of movement activists in the state legislatures over the decades, saying, what have we learned here? What are our best practices, lessons learned? What did we do wrong? And so we're always trying to get different pieces of legislation passed, and everybody's doing it differently, and we forget, what happened, what went well, what didn't go well. So they put together a legislative manual, and originally with 20 model bills in it, and a lot of explanation of best practices and lessons learned and talking points. This is the strategy manual, and they actually had it on their own website. And honestly, I'd never seen anything like it. One of the things I tell reporters, and I'll repeat here, is when I saw that for the first time, as somebody who studied these things for decades, I knew what I was seeing. It'd be gobbledygook to a lot of people, but because of my peculiar area of research and writing, this made sense to me. And it was like a scientific discovery or archaeological find, So you see it, you recognize what it is, and the world changes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how it's been for me for the past 3 years, learning about this manual. I wrote an expose about it, and then got a hold of the manual for the next state legislative session, and wrote an expose about that. And then they went dark. And we'll talk about what's in the manual in a minute, but just sort of an overview of the history. And that's so very briefly, they went dark. They took everything related to Project Blitz off their website. I think it became too toxic because media was taking intensive interest, and their opposition groups. And I have to say, a huge coalition of civil rights groups and national religious groups, the National Council of Churches, the leaders of Reform Judaism, lots of people got together and wrote a letter and said, this is wrong. They wrote a letter to every state legislator in the country and said, we oppose this. And whether it was American Atheists or the National Council of Churches, everybody was on the same page about the nature of religious freedom and the threat of Christian nationalism and how legislators should be gulled by this stuff. It was fabulous. And I can send you a link to the letter if people want to see
we
it.
need to put that in the blog when it gets written, for sure.
Absolutely. So they went dark for 2 years, and we knew that Project Blitz was still active in the state legislatures. They have state level prayer caucuses modeled on the Congressional Prayer Caucus. And they were moving these model bills, they were introducing them, and sometimes they were passed in state legislatures across the country. But then a few weeks ago, I got a hold of the missing 2 years of their legislative playbooks and did yet another expose. So we know a lot about what they've been up to all this time. And this is what democracy is, It's like there are these contending forces, and you have journalists who try to find out what's going on. Sometimes you get lucky and you hit the pot of gold or the archaeological find, and it changes things. And I've come to see things differently, and that's helpful to me, and it's helpful to readers. So people have found it to be so far. But here's what's in the playbooks, right? Again, it's the strategy manual. And whatever competitive enterprise you're in, it doesn't matter whether it's chess or baseball or business or wars, right? If you have the strategy of the other side, you are at some strategic advantage, and there's a lot to be learned there. So there were bills that were intended to be low-hanging fruit, things that they thought they could easily pass, or politicians would look bad if they opposed it. Sort of the most popular one of those were bills that would require or allow the posting of the national motto, "In God We Trust," in the public schools. Like, who could be opposed to that? It's the national motto, And so the idea—
But it wasn't a national motto, if I remember correctly. They added that to even our currency a long time ago. Am I misremembering from your book, Eternal Hostility?
Well, the short version of the history there, it's a little complicated, but short version is that back in the late 1700s, and went forward since, the national motto was "E pluribus unum." It's the Latin phrase for out of many, one. Mm-hmm. And that's a wonderful statement about just political and geographical and religious diversity coming together as one, right? It's a beautiful statement of what democratic philosophy and government actually is. But in the 50s, we were engaged in the Cold War. And so even though there have been some Christian nationalist types who succeeded in getting "In God We Trust" on some of the currency, but not all of it, and in some popular use, it never became the national motto until the 50s, when in the struggle with communism, right, in the Cold War, we needed to have God on our side. Right, and so God was
well, because of communism was Satan, right? That was the pseudo logic that we got to do it because Satan's too powerful, and we need to.
That's part of it. Godless communists.
Yeah.
Right? Anybody who didn't think like conservative Christians, in government, were godless communists. It didn't matter if you were Jack Kennedy, and a Catholic, you were a godless communist.
Well, that's what they're saying about Biden now, and all the Democrats were all godless communists, right?
That's all right. Sort of ridiculous, setting up the straw man of the commie boogeyman, is coming back into political practice. So. In God We Trust is a part of that, right? Yeah. God is on our side, right? And that's what God intended. That's what the founding fathers intended. And so therefore, that's the national motto, and you hang it in the public schools. So what's wrong with that, right? Well, for people have different ideas of God in the first place.
For sure.
And so, God, if people who don't believe in God, or maybe they have multiple gods, right? You can feel kind of out of place. But there's also the question about, why is a government institution and a government employee, principals and school teachers hanging a political slogan about God in the classroom in the first place,
Right.
And our friend, State Senator John Marty in Minnesota, spoke out against this stuff and was smeared by Fox News and by the right-wing media because he fell for the trap.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He opposed it. How can you oppose these things? He was speaking up for the people who didn't believe in God, and Muslims and people of different understandings who could feel sort of otherized, right, and alienated within a classroom that's supposed to be for everybody. Now they were picking. He's one of my heroes because they messed with the wrong guy. He's a faithful Lutheran, and he comes from a family of Lutheran clergy. His father is like one of the most famous Protestant theologians of the 20th century, Martin Marty, and his brother is a Lutheran minister who is the editor and publisher of Christian Century magazine, sort of the central magazine of mainline Protestantism. Mm-hmm. And his children have become Lutheran clergy, and he goes to church every Sunday, and he believes, as you and I do, in religious freedom in the way that we're talking about it, and religious pluralism and religious equality for everybody. He personally found the idea of in God we trust on the money or in the classroom as offensive, right? Offensive to him because it's a kind of reductionism. His idea of God and faith is more complicated than a government slogan on the wall. He found it a kind of idolatry. And whether you're conservative Christian or a liberal Christian, the idea of idolatry is pretty important.
Yep.
You believe in the Ten Commandments and Jews.
Idolatry.
So a government slogan passing for is certainly in the realm of idolatry. So serious religious thinkers and people who take their Christianity seriously are offended by this, and they should be. So that's where a lot of the battle around this is, right? Why should anybody care? In God we trust was officially the national motto. Shouldn't have been, but it is for all the wrong reasons. And now it's being deployed in the way that it was in the 50s to smear and discredit people who are in opposition to certain political programs.
Yeah, it's propaganda, really, on many levels. Mm-hmm. So talk about Project Blitz Watch and what people are trying to do.
Okay, well, real briefly, there's 20 more bills, but generally, there's the low-hanging fruit kinds of bills you're not supposed to be able to oppose, and easily got passed, and many of them have. In a couple of dozen states, this kind of legislation has passed, and in fact, these posters are being hung in the schools and public buildings.
Just because they put people in those positions where they could pass it, and nobody understood what the significance was strategically, that this was an incremental a cumulative strategy in order to gain more power.
Well, that's right. And so conservatives, since Ronald Reagan, wanted part of a conservative philosophy is you want to decentralize a lot of governmental functions, and the federal government's too powerful is something they're opposed to. Reagan succeeded in devolving an awful lot of policy to the states. And so there was infrastructure in the conservative Christian movement to figure out, a lot of policy is in the states. Now what do we do, right? And so they developed an infrastructure of think tanks and policy shops, but they also needed to elect a lot of people to the state legislature. And this became a big priority. And so it was during the Obama years that huge numbers of state legislative seats and chambers were overtaken. And so once you have the power, you need an agenda to move. And this is where what we call bill mills started to kick in, right? So Project Blitz is a bill mill. It means that you have generic model bills ready to present to legislators who are sympathetic. They can adjust it to according to their local, their state circumstances, but the basic ideas, are there. And that's why we've seen, scores of bills on a variety of subjects, not just in God we trust, be passing state legislators where these folks didn't used to have the power, but now they do.
It sounds a bit like bills that lobbyists give to politicians who are funded, whether it's Koch Industries or somebody else. Here's a bill. and then put your name to it and, submit it. And it often happens.
It does. And some of it is quite corrupt. And some of it is that, well, there are people who do it with greater transparency, right? You know that a certain kind of bill from whoever's putting it out, and there's a legislator who says, yeah, well, I agree with NARAL, and on abortion rights, and I'm taking their legislation, I'm going to try to do something with it. And whether people are liberal or conservative or business oriented or labor oriented, right? Then there's lots of that, and that's normal stuff, right?
Uh-huh.
And the more transparent it is, well, the fairer it is. But there's lots of people who do sneaky stuff too, and that's where Project Blitz found itself in, being compared to like the pornography industry and the tobacco industry in terms of the corrupting influence they were having on democratic institutions and values, and I think that was fair.
That's very powerful. I had never heard that comparison with pornography before in the tobacco industry, but it makes sense.
Sure, because we're talking about policy, right? And everybody's got their lobbyists and their lawyers, and everybody's trying to influence policy. That's normal in a democracy. And there are going to be corrupt, powerful interests, and there's just going to be fairly competing interests too. And it's up to us as citizens to understand that that's going on. We're never going to know everything, but we at least need to know the game in which we're engaged. Because if we don't know the game and we're not on the playing field, we've given up the game.
Right. So what do we do, Fred?
Well, we don't have a lot of time left, so I'll urge people to read up on Project Blitz. You can read my articles and get the whole story. But so yeah, what do we do? And I mean, we've hit on two things in this conversation so far. I mean, one is to really know in our bones what religious freedom is, so we're not taken in, whether it's by the cult recruiter, or the Christian right political lobby or whatever it is. Like, we need to know what religious freedom means and how it sits, in democracy as it has been, and our best aspirations for the future.
Yep.
We're not there. We say we have a democracy, but yeah, it works better for some people than others, and we have a distance to go in that regard. And we need to acknowledge that too, because we're responsible for each other in this democracy. And that's one thing. But to salvage democracy and its institutions against those who clearly want to use the tools of democracy, and that's what is being done here. You elect people, you get good at electing people who don't really believe in democracy, want to erode it, want to end it someday. Well, once you understand that that's the intention, and it is, and I've proven it many times over, this is not a conspiracy theory, and it ain't rocket science to understand.
No, it's fact-based.
It's just it is fact-based. They say it themselves in many different ways. So given that that's how things are, it's up to the rest of us to really launch a mobilization for democracy. And that takes a lot of different facets and takes different people, different kinds of knowledge and skills. But to the extent that we're all in this together, if we want democracy and its institutions, the best of its institutions, the best of our aspirations to survive, it's going to take us spending a little less time on entertainment, movies and sports, popular music,
video gaming,
sports, video gaming, professional sports. Like I say, if you don't know the starting lineup at the school board, you're out of the picture.
Yep. Great point.
So those are sort of the two biggies, one of the things that the ancient Chinese military philosopher and poet, Sun Tzu says is that you don't attack the enemy, you attack the enemy's strategy. And so it's up to us, who can understand strategy and what it is, to find ways to respond to the strategy. I don't care what the latest bad thing that a TV preacher said. Somebody said a bad thing. So what? What are they doing to erode democracy and to end it? And it's more about what people do and less about what they say. So that's why the Project Blitz strategy manual is so important, because you can find out a lot about what they're doing and you can arrive. So in all of my articles, right, I've embedded links to the manual itself. It's not just an expose, It's like, here is the strategy manual of this important grouping, and you can read it too.
Right. But so I'm going to poke you a little bit, if I may, and say if there's a head of a philanthropic foundation that's concerned about open societies and freedom of for the world and human rights, do they just contact you, or like how do they get involved? Because it seems to me like this is a big project to develop materials to educate citizens, especially young activists, what come to mind. Something bigger needs to be done here, no?
Well, that's right. I'm really throwing out a very large challenge, because business as usual, I'm not picking on anybody in particular, business as usual isn't working as well as it should. And in order for us to prevail in the things that we're talking about, the things that we say are our most deeply held values, well, they are under threat and we need to act like it. And so that means, well, okay, what do we need to think differently, do differently, read differently, donate differently? Yeah, absolutely. It's going to change. It's going to require a different orientation from the powerful philanthropists to the ordinary citizens. Less distraction, more commitment to democracy, learning the mechanics. Mm-hmm. So yeah, to find me, I work for Political Research Associates. Politicalresearch.org. I'm not hard to find, and but I'm just one guy.
Yeah, I'm just one guy too, and yet, more and more people are reading my stuff and saying, "What do we do, Steve?" And I'm like, I'm an idea guy. I'm a therapist. I write books, but we need a big think tank action group and real organization to do this and do it quickly.
And probably a lot of organizations. What I always tell people is, don't wait for the big foundation grant. Don't ask permission of national organizations. They don't want to hear from you. Figure it out and start your own local group. And because nothing sells like success. And if you have something to bring to the table, people pay attention to you. If you don't, probably not. But if in your community you've gone out and you registered 100 new voters and you're getting them organized, people pay attention. Trust me, I've been there, and I know that if anybody shows up and starts doing things and having success at organizing people, the powers that be notice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great idea. Do you feel like it's of some value to write opinion pieces or write to congressmen and senators and those types of things, or do you really think it should be done locally for most people?
They're not mutually exclusive ideas, but most people are not letter writers and opinion page writers and things like that. And that's why I say that people have different kinds of talents and skills and leadership to bring, and figuring out what those are is a part of the process. There's certain things that I do, but certain things that I just wouldn't be that good at. I'm fond of saying that I think that the greatest geniuses that I've ever encountered are the people who know how to fix my car. But
or
this
fix
is
our bodies when they get
exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. But we're all of these kinds of people, and it's going to take all of these kinds of people to make it go. And the people who are trying to erode religious freedom and democracy, as we've always understood it, understand this extremely well, and know that there are a variety of arenas in which people can have talents, and they need to grow their skills and their knowledge and their leadership, and they're ahead of us.
Yeah, really important points. I'm tempted to ask you to at least touch on, because we're running out of time, on the Council for National Policy or Jeffrey Charlotte's work on the family, because I think most people don't know these two entities and what they've been doing for so many decades.
Well, yeah, it's like I said, the Christian right of the 18th century didn't like democracy and the Constitution the way it was happening, and their descendants have continued in that view. It's just that they've created institutions and that have adapted to the times. Now, in the case of what Jeff Charlotte's written about with the family, also known as the Fellowship, it began as a group of conservative Christians who didn't like unions in Seattle. And so unions represented godless communism to them. And so they began to create conservative Christian religious networks that stood for their kinds of values and preserve conservative business interests over, say, the human rights of others. And they developed an international constituency. And so when you hear about like the National Prayer Breakfast that used to be held at the White House since Eisenhower, that's the family. And they have access to power. Now, Obama, to his credit, moved it out of the White House, saying this is a bit much, but he still spoke at their event. They are that powerful that even Obama, was attacked from the podium by their featured speakers in his presence. They're powerful enough to get away with doing that.
When he was president?
When he was president, yes. Wow. And it was really kind of astounding to see. So yeah, their network is that powerful that cuts across both parties, more Republicans than Democrats, but nevertheless, it is a movement in that way, with always an eye towards cultivating and employing power.
And I can't help but add, Fred, that my former cult leader, Sun Myung Moon, was at a family prayer breakfast and ushered immediately to the White House to meet with Richard Nixon in person during Watergate. And people like me, Moonies, were told to fast and pray for Nixon during Watergate because God wanted Nixon to be president.
That's right. And it's always important to remember there's always a variety of factions, and cults that, you wouldn't think would be able to work together, but they do. And they carry out different functions in different ways. If it's, sending Moonies to the steps, to to do a PR show for the cabbers, well, that's what they do. And so some of these kinds of things are normal in democracy, but some of them, are about undue influence and control in support of anti-democratic politics, as we saw in that case. Now, the Council for National Policy is interesting because they're an invitation-only, paid membership council of important Christian right and conservative political leaders of different sorts. And really started as a project of the John Birch Society, but with an eye towards the conservative Christian side of those things. And so, it's tempting to sort of see them as the ultimate conspiracy where everybody's making plans, and that's a bit much. But nevertheless, it's important not to de-emphasize or diminish in any way their significance, because this is where powerful interests, come together to make plans. Now, one of the stories that I broke about the Council for National Policy was that I learned that the original plan and to impeach Bill Clinton, the plan to draw up articles of impeachment, was done at a Council for National Policy meeting held in Canada, right? And that's where it was decided what was going to be done and who was going to do it. And it was then Representative Bill Barr from Georgia who led the charge on that. So they can be that important.
Yeah, and I just want to, again, connect the dots with my former cult, the Moonies. They had Gary Jarman from the very beginning, and I recently learned that they had James Whelan, who was then inserted as the founding editor of Moon's paper, the Washington Times, and oversaw that until he resigned because he felt like he was being pressured too much to do just Korean propaganda, I think.
Yeah, that's what he said, and I believe him. It's, people in politics are complicated, and they don't fit in simple little boxes and niches, and so to make things work, if you're the conservative movement, these are the institutions that you create. But what's important for people to understand is that they're not monolithic and they're not all powerful, and with the case of Council for National Policy, we know who they are, and Ann Nelson's written a wonderful book about it called The Shadow Network. And, it's possible for us to learn about these things. And we're still a democracy. We still have a free press. We're still able to say things. We're still able to learn things. And the trick for us is to apply our knowledge and not get so intimidated by the fact that, oh, somebody I don't like, has a big interest group or a lot of money. Well, so what? You don't necessarily need a big interest group or a lot of money to make a profound difference.
Right.
And I can tell you that just from my tiny little sliver of the world, I got a hold of Project Blitz strategy documents and I published about it, and people acted upon it, and I'm just one guy.
Yeah, so I'm hoping people will listen to this, and when we get the blog together, read it and share it, and something good will come out of your efforts today. Any last words that you'd like to leave our audience with, Fred?
Oh, wow. Probably too many. We have to start a whole new thing. But again,
we can do it again, Fred. We can do another one.
All right. But again, to come away, I mean, if there's one thing that people need to understand is that, there is hope, there is possibility. People really do have much more power than they may think. And I see that in evidence just all the time. So, the bullies, the rich and the powerful, the people who want to take your rights, the people who want to take away your precious right of religious freedom, they act like they have all the power, but quite honestly, they just don't. They're just human beings too.
Great. Thank you so much for your incredible work and your civic mindedness and your human rights activism. Thank you for teaching me so much, and you were
Likewise.
kindly helped me, and you helped edit the Cult of Trump book and guided me in many important understandings about all of the authoritarian cults that were operating in Trump's administration and what is happening right now with the follow-up of that mess. So thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. And, all the things we learned in studying the cult of Trump and the related interests, all those folks are still out there. And so whatever we learned in that process, those are lessons and knowledge that we can apply right now.
Yeah, there was nothing incorrect about the thing. There was more I could have added if I knew it then, but it's still rock solid. So thank you, Fred, so much.
Well, thank you, Steve.
Okay.
Glad we were able to do this.
Great.